Sinas Chinam. Before we try to understand what Sinas Chinam is, there are two words that are used for an enemy. One is a soine and one is an oyev. And if we can understand, if we can define the difference between the two, then perhaps it will make it easier to understand what Sinas Chinam really is. There are no synonyms in Lashon HaKodesh, which means that a soine is different from an oyev, and an oyev is different from a soine. An oyev, that's relatively easy to understand. An oyev is somebody who hates because I have something that he doesn't have. I have something that he wants. His lack of what I have leads him towards hatred. That's really the basis of territorial wars throughout history. The other side has something. We'll go to war, we'll kill for it. A soine is something else altogether, though. A soine is somebody who can't abide that you have something, period. It doesn't matter whether he wants it, it doesn't matter whether he has it, it doesn't matter whether he needs it. The very fact that you have it is what causes him to hate. He just doesn't want you to have it. Rav Baruch Mimezhibot, one of the great Hasidic rabbis, used to say, how pleasant the world is if you don't subjugate yourself to it, and how difficult it is if you do. Sinner is an all-encompassing emotion that stops a person from being able to understand and to see the world clearly. A soine has no benefit. If somebody is an oyev, so at least through his hatred, if he can take away what it is that the other person has, so at least he gains something from it. A soine gains nothing. All it does normally is cost the person who hates more than anybody else in return. Sinas Chinam doesn't mean hating for no reason. It means hating without sense. It could very well be that at the beginning there was a reason. There was some kind of a motivation, a catalyst that caused a person to feel the way that he does. But it's now snowballed into something which is out of control. And of course, the classic story that defines Sinas Chinam in the Talmud is the story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa, which I'm sure over the last few weeks that's all anybody's been hearing about. Of the person who was invited unintentionally to a suda, to a meal. And when the Balabayit saw him, when the host saw him, he wanted to throw him out. And rather than embarrass himself, he offered to pay for his meal, he offered to pay for half of the meal, he offered to pay for the whole banquet. A misunderstanding, he received an invitation that was supposed to go to somebody else. Instead of going to Kamsa, it went to Bar Kamsa instead. A very easy mistake to make. Ask Seir and Yaakov. All of you are familiar with the Talmud, all of you are familiar with that particular story. Ask Seir and Yaakov a very simple question. The destruction of the temple began with the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. And yet Kamsa had nothing to do with the story. The invitation was given by mistake to Bar Kamsa, and the host of the banquet, whose name we don't even know, is the one who caused the embarrassment. And Kamsa is just a side detail because he happened to share a name which was similar to the person who was invited by mistake. Explains Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz something which is terrifying. Chorban Abayis, the temple was destroyed because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, and yet Kamsa didn't do anything. Explains Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, Sinas Chinam, the one that's described in the story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa, is not referring to active hatred. It's referring to disinterest. Not caring if other people slip into behavior which is unacceptable. And writes Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, do you have a greater hater than this? One who sees his friend drowning in a river of sin and doesn't protest. It's clear that sinas chinam is not necessarily referring to active hatred. Sinas chinam, included inside of sinas chinam, is a concept of apathy. Apathy towards the pain of another person. Apathy in a refusal to help another person grow spiritually. The Ben Ish Chai, in his Perush on the Talmud, suggests that Kamsa was actually present at the banquet. He was there as well. And he saw what was happening to Bar Kamsa. He saw the way that he was treated. He saw the embarrassment. And he could have easily have got up and explained, Rabbi Say, it's a mistake. Kamsa, Bar Kamsa, we share the same name. There must have been a muddle up with the invitations. And says the Ben Ish Chai, Kamsa didn't do anything. He just sat there and he watched everything unfold. And say Chazal, that Chorban Abayis, the responsibility lies with Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. Kamsa, who didn't do anything, who we would say has no responsibility whatsoever, and yet Chazal say not like that. Because of his passivity, because he wasn't prepared to get involved to help another Jew, so he's held partially responsible for the destruction of the temple. Gemara says, on Shabbos, Daf Nun Daled Amud Beis, it's a very, very disturbing Gemara. That a person can lead an exemplary life. He can keep the mitzvahs. He can learn Torah. But if he doesn't stop other people from sinning, when he gets to the Yeshiva Shel Maila, he'll be judged and he'll be punished. Sinas chinam. Perhaps not the way we always thought, of some hatred that builds up inside of a person that overwhelms them and causes them to behave in an irrational, in an illogical way. No. Something far more basic. Sinas chinam means to not be concerned, to not care about other people around you. It's a strange combination of words. Sinas chinam. So Rav Shamshon Ufol Hirsch, Gedanke HaKodesh, says that the word chinam doesn't necessarily mean something which is free, something which is baseless. But rather the word chinom comes from the word chen. Motzo chen, to find grace in something, to connect together to something for no obvious reason. Says Rav Hirsch, sinas chinam is that somebody has an intangible affinity to that characteristic, to that trait. There's no reason. Its source is a Yetzer Hara. There is no reason why a person should turn a blind eye to somebody who's doing something, who needs help. There is no reason why a person should ignore somebody who wants to grow spiritually. And yet that's one of the definitions of sinas chinam. That we don't pay attention. That we don't care about the feelings of those that are around us. The trigger for this shir actually came from my youngest son. Told me over a vort in the name of Moran Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Steinen Shlita. Asked a very simple question. There are many negative qualities. Sinna is just one of them. It's kina, jealousy, taiva, lust. There's no end to the list of negative qualities. And yet we never talk about kinas chinam or gaivas chinam. Ask Rabbi Lauffer, why do we talk about sinas chinam? How come there's something about sinner which we add on that extra definition of chinam which doesn't exist by anything else? And explains Rabbi Lauffer, because every other negative quality, every other negative trait is all b'chinam anyway. There is no redeeming dimension to kina. There is no redeeming dimension to gaiva. There is no redeeming dimension to taiva. But says Rabbi Lauffer, unfortunately there are times when a person might be justified to hate somebody else. A person sees a disgusting thing being done. According to the halacha, it may be permissible for him to hate. So explains Rabbi Lauffer, there's a whole new designation of sinas chinam. Don't imagine that because there are rare occasions when it's permissible to hate, that all of a sudden it's now a mitzvah to hate under all circumstances. Remember when I was a child growing up, I heard the most astonishing story. One of the Musa giants from the previous generation, of Eli Lapian. Somebody once did something to him. I have no idea what he did, but somebody once did something to him, and he came to ask his forgiveness. Rabbi Elia said to him, "Come back in a week." And in a week, the person came back, and Rabbi Elia told him, "I forgive you." And the fellow, I don't know where he found the chutzpah to do this, but the fellow in his chutzpah, he said to Rabbi Elia that he thanks the mashkiach very much for forgiving him, but why did he have to come back a week later? Why wasn't it enough to forgive him the first time he asked? And Rav Elia Lapian, one of the great Musa giants from the previous generation, said like this. He said, you should know that what you did to me hurt me very much. I was truly, truly offended. And it took me a whole week of working on myself, on my midas, to be able to forgive you. And that's why I told you to come back after a week. Would an Elia have been justified to have a hatred towards that person? It sounds like he would. And yet, says Boran Rosh Hashiva, Sinas Chinam, to not allow ourselves to go down the path of hating, even if there was some kind of a justification for the hatred at the beginning, to not allow ourselves to go down that path. This Nalput explains in a similar fashion, Sinas Chinam doesn't mean that the hatred was causeless. It's a mistake. We call it baseless hatred. It's a mistake. But explains Rabbi Nissen Alpert, Sinas Chinam means that the person doesn't deal with his hatred. Either because of the potential fallout between himself and the other person, or because he talks himself into imagining that he wasn't really hurt. But the hurt is still there. And it's festering. And it's like a little ball of acid that sits inside of his stomach, and it grows until it becomes Sinas Chinam. Says Rav Aaron Leib Steinman, the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed because of Sinas Chinam, and it's forbidden to allow ourselves to find reasons to hate another person. Sinas Chinam is not something which is peculiar to the Jewish nation. It's not only Jews that suffer from the disease of Sinas Chinam. The most astonishing story in the book, A World Without Jews, The Nazi Imagination from Persecution to Genocide, by Professor Alon Confino, tells over the most incredible story. There was a small town called Ratzenburg in Pomerania. And prior to Kristallnacht, prior to November 1938, they forced the Jewish community there to disband, and they forced the Jewish community to sell the shul. It was turned into an egg market. The small, beautiful shul was no longer, and instead they sold eggs over there. And in November 1938, in Kristallnacht, and hundreds of localities across Germany, shuls were destroyed, and shuls were set on fire, and communities were set adrift. And Nebuch, the non-Jewish community in Ratzenburg, didn't have a shul to destroy because they'd forced the Jewish community to sell them their shul before Kristallnacht. What kind of locality could you be if you don't have a burnt shul? So listen to what they did. The Jewish community was forced to annul the sale and to return the money that they received after being made to sell the shul the first time around. And the eggs were removed from the shul. The synagogue was restored. And then the people of Ratzenburg set it on fire. That is Sinas Chinam. or in the words of an English philosopher, an anti-Semite is someone who hates Jews more than is necessary. Sinas Chinam is a disease that spreads itself around, and we have to learn how to control it. Shlomo Bloch explains that the 70 years of the first Golus after the destruction of the first temple was because of 70 Shmitas that Klal Yisrael didn't keep. That's already Divrei Chazal. We're almost 2,000 years in exile now because of Sinas Chinam. We're being punished in ratio to the sin. Shemitah, it's hard. We're in a Shemitah year right now. Shemitah's hard, but not hating somebody, b'chinam, that's something which we're all capable of doing, which is why the punishment is far greater in ratio to the sin. That's why we're still in Golus. It's an avodah. And part of the avodah is what? Because sometimes we are justified not to hate, and we are justified to hate. And yet we're being taught not to hate. Listen to this astonishing story. One Jew wouldn't allow himself to become consumed by bitterness and by hatred. About 20 years ago, in a summer camp in America, somewhere in the mountains, a father and a grandfather went to visit their daughter who was in camp, daughter and granddaughter. And they were walking along the paths over there, and their paths crossed with an elderly gentleman who was walking in the other direction. As they went in their different directions, they nodded to each other, these two old men. The son, never seen the other person before, turned to his father and he said to him, "Tati, who was that?" So his father told him he was my best friend in Chavrusa before the war when we were growing up in Satmar. The son was a little taken aback. He'd never seen this person before. And he couldn't understand if this was his father's childhood friend, his Chavrusa, his best friend from back in the Alta Haim. So how come they just nodded at each other and kept walking? How come they didn't fall into each other's arms at the most incredible reunion? His father told him like this. He said, before the war, I succeeded in procuring exit visas for myself and for my wife and for my children. The time hadn't come yet to use them, so I hid them. I didn't tell anybody where the hiding place was. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell my siblings. The only person who knew where I'd hidden them was my chavrusa, my best friend. When the time came to use those visas, they weren't there. My best friend had taken them, and with those visas he saved himself and his wife and his family, and I lost my wife and my children. And the son couldn't understand. He said to him, "Tati, so why did you nod at him? Why didn't you go over to him and start screaming at him?" Why didn't you go and accuse him of being a murderer? And his father said to him, "Mein Sohn, those were different times. And I should never have put him in that nisayon to begin with." Sinas chinam is not that one day somebody wakes up and just decides that he's going to hate somebody else. Sinas chinam is not some fabrication in a person's mind. Sinas chinam is based on a logical, rational, even halachically justifiable reason to hate. And yet we're taught that was the root of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and that's the root of why the Beis Hamikdash hasn't been rebuilt today. The response of that grandfather is almost beyond our capabilities to comprehend. We flare into anger at others without making the slightest effort to perceive the situation from their point of view. We nurture grudges for the smallest slights for years. How many times have we, all of us, heard from people that they don't talk to that person over there, and when you ask them why, they don't remember? It's a family tradition. I'm not joking. Grandparents fall out with each other. And all of a sudden, 2 generations down the line, the only thing that people know is that we don't speak to that side of the family. They don't know why. They don't know what. And normally it's about petty, superficial issues. Look what happened with that man. He lost his wife, he lost his children, and yet he wouldn't allow himself to be consumed by anger and by bitterness. What did he do? He taught himself to look at the situation through the eyes of his best friend and understand what drove his friend to do that. 19th century German philosopher Nietzsche wrote, "What is evil? Whatever springs from weakness." Sinas chinam is something which has its roots only in one place, in weakness. And from that weakness will come nothing but evil. Yesterday, it's called Shabbos Chazon. The Shabbos before Tisha B'Av. Everybody here knows, I imagine, that it's called Shabbos Chazon because it's named after the Haftorah which is read. Chazon Yeshayahu. Asked Rav Hirsch, why is it called Chazon Yeshayahu? Why not Nevuah? Masa. Different lashonos that could have been used. Why Chazon? And he explains like this. The word Chazon normally translates as a vision. But really, it refers to the Navi's ability to see things that others cannot see. In the case of the Haftorah, Yeshaya is looking at the generation that he lived in 150 years before Chorban Habayis, and he sees the spiritual state of the nation. Listen carefully to the way the Rav Hirsch describes it, because it's uncanny. Outwardly, everything seems to be just fine. The Beis Hamikdash was functioning optimally. People bringing korbanos every day. The Sanhedrin was in place. Fluency in Torah, the Torah knowledge was extraordinary. People could approach the Nevi'im whenever they had questions, whenever they needed advice, whenever they needed direction. They could just turn to the Navi. But the prophet Yeshaya saw something that no one else saw. He saw what was underneath the surface. He saw within the minds and the hearts of the people. And he saw that the vast majority of them were not in good shape at all. They had shut Hashem out of their minds. Kodesh Baruch Hu belongs in the Beis Hamikdash. Kodesh Baruch Hu belongs in the Shiurim. HaKodesh Baruch Hu belongs in the Beis Hamedrash. But their hearts were cold and hard. Shabbos Chazon, the Haftorah that was chosen to be read every Shabbos before Tisha B'Av to teach us what? That we're no better. Everything looks great. Everything looks fine. The Bate Medrash K'nai Nahara are full. Talmud scholarship is at an unprecedented level. But the heart is missing. The desire to live the lives that we need to live, because that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to do, and for no other reason. One of the great Hasidic Rebbes, Rabbi Zev Wolf, Mizitmer, he writes like this: Ad shata doyeg ma taseh machar, until, don't worry about what you're going to do tomorrow. Until you worry about what you're going to do tomorrow, mutav shetitaken ma she'asita etmol. First, take care of the mistakes that you made yesterday. If there is a motif that can carry us throughout Jewish history, maybe that's what it needs to be. Until you're worried about what you're going to do tomorrow, first take care of the mistakes that were made yesterday. We are the Am HaNivchar. We've been chosen by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to bring His light down here into this world. The Beis Hamikdash was the source of all the light in the world. And through Sinas Chinam, we destroyed that light. We didn't extinguish it because the light of Torah is still here, Baruch Hashem. But we certainly did our best. It's a horrifying story. Reb Mendele, the son of the Sfas Emes, the second Rebbe Migur, he was rounded up together with Hasidim by the Nazis, and he was taken out to be murdered. And they were being led to the crematorium, and they were so moved by the fact that they were going to be able to die al Kiddush Hashem by sanctifying God's name, that, believe it or not, they started to run towards the ovens. And the Nazis, Yamach Shmam v'Zichram, they didn't know what to do. This they'd never seen before. The whole idea of destroying the Jewish nation was to take away that sense of godliness And here all of a sudden you have a group who are running towards the crematorium in order to fulfill the mitzvah of dying al Kiddush Hashem. And they started to scream and shout to them that they have to stop and they're not allowed to run, and they didn't listen to them. Until finally, one of the Nazi officers picked up a small Jewish child and threw it at the feet of Rav Mendele. He stopped running. And he picked up that Taira kind, that pure child. And he turned to his Hasidim and he told them like this: how does the sun know that it is powerful? How does the sun know that the light that emanates from it, the rays that it sends down, are so powerful that they can destroy? It says when the sun sees that people cannot look at the sun directly, that they have to look at the sun through smoky glass in order to be able to look, then the sun knows that it is truly powerful. And then Rav Mendele told them, how do we know that we were created B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? How do we know that we are, our neshamas are a chelek Eloka mimal? That our neshamas come from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they're a part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? From the fact that the Germans can't look at the face of this Jewish child. This is how we know for certain that the light of the Shekhinah shines out of his face. Rabbi said, we are all that Jewish child. We were all created B'Tselem Elokim. We are all a chelek Eloka mimal. And it's incumbent upon each and every one of us to do something to show the world that that's who we are. At the beginning of Megillas Eicher, the pasuk says, Kol rodfeya hesigua bein hamitzarim. All her pursuers caught her between the cliffs. This time that we're in right now, that's drawing to a close, is called Bein HaMitzarim, between the cliffs, in an untenable position. There's a Kliyaka on Pasha's Dvarim. Something incredible. Explains the Kliyaka. When we're threatened by an enemy, there are two ways to escape. If you have a strong connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then he'll take care of everything. That's one way. But says the Kliyaka, even if we're disconnected from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but we're connected to each other, if we're united together, if we work in harmony, we can defeat the enemy. And for sure, if you have both, then for sure, we'll be able to succeed. So surely then, Klal Yisrael, we surely have those two dimensions, those two strengths to save us from the tzaras of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, our connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the unity that unifies the Jewish people. It says the Kliyaka on Yud Zayin B'Tammuz, Klal Yisrael made the Chet HaEgel, the Egel Azov, they made the golden calf. What did they do when they fabricated that golden calf? What did they do? They severed the connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. On Tisha B'Av, Klal Yisrael listened to the report of the Meraglim. And the roots of the sin of the Meraglim, says the Kliyaka, is sinas chinam. The same sinas chinam that later on destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, and the same sinas chinam which we're living with today, and that the Beis Hamikdash hasn't been rebuilt yet. On the one side, we have the loss of support from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from the Egel Azov. On the other side, we have the sinas chinam, which has destroyed the achdus, the unity within inside of the Jewish people. Between the two, there's no escape. That's a pshat of Bein HaMetzarim. Between the tzara of Yud Zayin B'Tammuz and the tzara of Tisha B'Av, which is the tzara of disconnecting ourselves from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the tzara of disconnecting ourselves from each other. They say in English, you're stuck in between a rock and a hard place. But they say, in the name of the Tiferet Shlomo, most incredible knech to the pasuk, Koroit Theya Hesigua Bein HaMetzarim, says the Tiferet Shlomo, read it a different way. Kol Roideif Ka, whoever tries to get close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hesigua Bein HaMetzarim, you'll be able to do so within this time period that we're in right now. There's no greater period of Chorban than the period we're in right now. There's no greater period of Baseless, of mourning. But this is the time when we can approach HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we can achieve a closeness with HaKadosh Baruch Hu that's not possible at any other time. One Yom Kippur night, Rav Levi Yitzchok Mibaditchev, the greatest defender of Klal Yisrael, he turned to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and he cried out, Avinu Shebashamayim, our Father in heaven. Chazal teach that whoever says something over in the name of the person who says it brings the Geula. Well, I, Levi Yitzchok, want to quote something in your name. Vayoyma Hashem, salachti kidvorecha. And now you must redeem us. Yirotzen, shenizke kulanu biyachad b'mitz Hashem, to overcome the insidious might of sinas chinam, that we should begin to believe in ourselves to the point where we're able to relate to all those around us differently from the way that we have to up until now. And if we do that, not if, when we do that, b'mitz Hashem, we can all join together to walk down the road, to meet the Melech HaMoshiach, and to rejoice together with the whole of Klal Yisrael in the rebuilt Beis Hamikdash. Amen. Amen.